Okay, thank you very much to Mick for that introduction, as well to David Brand, Radha Capelli for inviting me over to a beautiful tour of Tasmania, as well to this very iconic view, which is kind of covered right now. I was asked to talk about sort of the nexus of my careers in government and banking and in advocacy. So let's see how we could kind of wrap it all up and see how we could invest in sustainable investments in Southeast Asia. Some of us here were children of rose gardeners, Peace Corps volunteers. We were either grew up in a farm or would love fishing. For me, in a country with 7,000 islands, it's not unusual to find yourself owning one. So I had one island in Palawan, and I was a bit annoyed because some of the fishermen were doing dynamite fishing and destructive illegal fishing. So that kind of got me personally involved in how can I try to educate and talk about marine conservation. And that led me to a career in environment. And in 1990, I got a rather unusual call from a former banker of Bankers Trust who was now doing conservation finance with WWF US. And she called me to try to do a deal when I was in Wall Street, a debt for nature swap. Rather interesting financial engineering structure. One of us here, Eric Swanson, was also involved with doing that at WWF. And that led me to a 20-year involvement with WWF worldwide. One of the things I did was to set up a company called Asian Conservation Company, which, loving the sea and going into fishing and scuba diving, I wanted to get involved with doing eco-resorts, sustainable tourism and eco-resorts. And this is typical. You bring a lot of friends to a resort, you drink a little bit of wine, a little bit of alcohol, and somebody starts saying, why do we buy this resort? And you kind of dismiss that to alcohol, right? Until the next morning, they bring it up again. And they say, Vince, seriously, why do we buy this resort? And so a group of friends decided to pool, partly venture philanthropy, partly program-related investment through personal foundations, and partly through just private equity. And we decided that we couldn't do this in a typical 10-year, 12-year type of fund. And so we created a 50-year corporate life type of structure, and with that, we ended up buying one resort, which led to a second resort, a third and fourth, until about 2 years ago, 14 years later, we divested to a party that was very much into sustainability. Like in the US, in the Philippines, one can get recruited either unwillingly into the government. And my former economics professor became president in 2001, and she started calling some of her students to join the cabinet. And you know, when you're called for national government service, sometimes you just have to say yes. And I ended up first initially as a deputy trade minister, as we call it here, and eventually in a little reshuffle, I ended up in energy. I'll be the first to tell you, in 2001, I knew very little about energy. But she wanted us to privatize the power state-owned, inefficient power sector, and that led me to, with my background in WWF, to really push a very ambitious renewable energy agenda, which is really a nexus of energy and environment, renewable energy. I worked together with my cabinet peers to push the Kyoto Protocol and really push really more with the agricultural lobby, a bioethanol law. It's really not an energy legislation, it is really an agricultural policy law. So we brought in sugarcane, mandatory sugarcane blending in gasoline, and believe it or not, cocoa diesel from coconut oil, cocoa methyl ester blend into diesel. We also passed a renewable energy law a few years ago. And in a way, I was able to put in a 12% VAT differential exemption for fossil fuel. Sorry, fossil fuel had an additional 12% VAT, while renewable source power had 0 VAT. And so that was sort of a pseudo carbon tax, if one might say. That's a picture of me in the lower left corner, together with the president, who's second to the right, the lady president, when we were signing the renewable energy law. Now, one of the challenges in most of these countries is that power rates are subsidized. fuel is subsidized. And you've seen pictures of headlines in Egypt and Nigeria and Indonesia that every time the government tried to reduce power subsidies, you have riots everywhere. And I came in as energy minister when the oil prices was $20 a barrel. And when the oil price went up by $2, hell break loose. So can you imagine that now when it went up to $150 a barrel at one point, you cannot sustain the subsidies, which is what Indonesia was dealing with. So my former economics professor, president, understood the economics of that, and I told her, we have to reduce and remove power subsidy if we're going to bring in private sector investments. So she made a deal with me, and she said, okay, I agree with you, but get me reelected first for a second term, and then you could do what you want. So she ran for office again, got reelected, and literally the day she was proclaimed, the day after, I said, Madam President, can we now remove power rates? And she said, yes, I promise you that, but on one condition. You explain to the public why we have to raise power rates. I'm not going to defend you, but I'll support you behind the scene. So literally, I went on a national roadshow, city by city, province by province, explaining why we have to remove power rates. And the buzz line was, the most expensive electricity is no electricity. Because if you subsidize power rates, no private sector investment is going to come in. And so literally, after months of public explanation and public education, overnight in September 2004, power rates went up by 40% overnight. And not a single riot broke loose. Now, the other mandate I was given was to try to electrify far-flung villages that currently had no electricity. And the mandate she gave me was electrify 4 villages a day with electricity, which is really a Herculean task. So obviously government funding was only limited, and the only way we could do that was either bring private sector money or bilateral aid funding. So like a former banker, I decided, let's syndicate the deal. So I started calling ambassadors. US, can USAID help out? Spain, can you do some solar support? France, the UNDP, the World Bank. And with that, we were able to electrify 6,000 villages in 4 years. Now, we were doing a lot of it ideally with solar because a lot of them were far-flung islands. And the problem is that you bring in infrastructure, but then the local village sometimes don't understand the technology. So once I flew into an island to inaugurate a solar system, and I saw newly washed laundry on top of a solar panel, as if it was a dryer, which effectively, made the whole solar system ineffective. But this is one of the most heartwarming programs I did because I met an 80-year-old grandmother who was, with tears in her eyes, said she thought she was going to die without seeing electricity in her home, and with this, she was able to see the gift of light. So these are some of the pictures of some of our rural electrification with a bias towards renewable, mainly solar, microhydro, and some off-grid wind. Of course, I got involved with WWF and ended up chairing the board in the Philippines, an international board. Here we are doing Earth Hour a few months ago. Little did I know, as a World WWF trustee, I've gone to places near and far, but this particular Earth Hour in March, I had to dance for the first time, Zumba, that evening. Maybe the first and last time I had to dance that. So, excuse me. I've been asked by New Forest to talk about what are the challenges of investing in Southeast Asia. One, you got to deal with multiple ministries, overlapping jurisdiction, where it's forestry, irrigation, environment, or even protected areas. A lot of these land tenure rights are overlapping. I have been shown a title whereby it's really a protected area, but somebody has a private title to it. So how did that person end up getting titled when it should be a national forest? And sometimes the only way to fix that, if you're trying to develop a project, is to buy 2 titles from 2 different people over the same land, just to get rid of the overlapping problem. A lot of these countries like Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, have a devolved sort of bottom-up approach in terms of consent. So you have to work to a village, or in Vietnam, a local people community of the Communist Party, and get their consent, move up to the mayor, down to up to the governor, all the way up. And you have to follow that chain before you could get national endorsement. So working with the village level consent is key. In some countries, there is limits to corporate land holdings because of land reform law or agricultural reform. And of course, indigenous people have to be included in a lot of this consent. Now, most of Southeast Asia's logging has been virgin forests, so there's very little familiarity with sort of sustainable plantation forest management. And there's a need for that, and later we'll talk about maybe opportunities for Australia in Southeast Asia. And last but not the least, the data itself is inconsistent, conflicting. A lot of these countries have colonial era type data. In the Philippines, US Geological Survey, in Netherlands, it's Dutch, or in Indonesia, it's Dutch resource. And so a lot of data is really old and needs modern remapping in that sense. So let's talk about a particular case study that we could talk about, which is Borneo. Borneo is the third largest island in the world, with only 1% of the land mass, but accounts for 6% of the biodiversity. Now, if some of you have gone on holiday there, they have orangutans, pygmy elephants, proboscis monkeys. But it's under threat right now by overexploitation of resources, logging, plantation, mining, hydropower, and eventually it could end up into what we call a biocapacity deficit. So the map you see, those in red are actually now completely cleared forests, denuded. The light green are now logged forests, and only the dark green is the remaining virgin forest in Borneo. So to try to protect this natural capital, which has been mentioned earlier, and I think Michael Jenkins talked about this, Richard Barrett talked about that in finance, and of course Joshua Bishop of WWF Australia talked about market transformation. You got to try to influence what we call drivers of change that are outside that particular heart of Borneo to try to protect the natural capital of Borneo. So on one hand, you work with policy, so either strengthening the forestry guidelines, trying to mandate 30% protected areas for Sabah, or mandatory sustainable forest management in Sarawak, and also trying to influence market behavior. We heard about the soft commodities compact of 10 banks, the Consumer Goods Forum, about 400 members that account for 4 trillion of buying power that want zero net deforestation by 2020. Or even a Dutch NGO called the Borneo Initiative that will give a grant to $2 per hectare to a forest concessionaire in order to comply with the certification process of the Forest Stewardship Council. So by changing market behavior, changing the source of financing, you try to influence and protect the natural capital. Last but not the least, we cannot ignore the indigenous people. In Borneo, there's about 1 million indigenous Dayaks, as we call them. In many ways, the forest is their social security. They depend on the forest for their livelihood, and you got to work with them getting free prior consent, because at the end of the day, they're really the stewards of the environment. Just putting it all together in sort of a framework, in order to drive change or protect a forest, you got to either work with policy framework to make sure there's equitable distribution of resources, modifying market demand as well as source of funding in terms of market transformation, and of course engaging with the civil society and the indigenous people, because at the end of the day, they're the one that's going to benefit from this. What are some of the lessons learned going forward? I think there is indeed demand for institutional money in real assets in Southeast Asia. We're seeing a lot of them coming in first now in renewable energy. I've listed about 5 bullet points here of potential investment opportunities. Plantations are being privatized. There is a New Zealand government-funded plantation that's just moribund right now in the Philippines that's waiting probably to be privatized. Or because of restrictions on land ownership, one can make a deal by having a long-term government lease of large tracts of land, a 25-year renewable for another 25 years. Was watershed management for geothermal plants in Indonesia and Philippines could be an interesting source of business as well. And I wouldn't get into Southeast Asia without a joint venture partner. Southeast Asia has 500 million people, about 20 times what we have in Australia, with a landmass much smaller than Australia. And so you got to deal with the people. You have to deal with the social fence. And that, when we visited Surrey Hills up in the fire tower, and I was asking them, do you have to deal with any human contact here? And Daryl was saying that there's hardly anyone here. And I said, wow, how lucky can you be? Because in these countries, you have to deal with people. And essentially, wrapping up, successful investments require local partners, as I said, knowledge and support. And I think this is where I think New Forest, not only bringing capital to Southeast Asia, but bringing world-class practices in sustainable plantation management, even world-class sawmill, which I got to see with Timberlinks, can bring a lot of value added to that part of the world. Thank you very much.
Stay with us, Vince. We're going to have a few questions now from the audience. I'm going to look around. Yep, we've got one. Jan down the back.
Thanks. And thanks, Vince, for mentioning watershed management. We've heard a little bit about water today, but given the importance of forests to water and some of the potential benefits in managing forests for water, could you say a little bit more about the investment potential in Southeast Asia?
Well, thank you, Jan. When we were privatizing the large hydro power plants in the Philippines, in order to comply with local law, which meant that land belongs to the state, but the power assets can be privatized to a private sector, we had to separate the two. So we sold the power plants to companies like in Norway or Pacific Hydro in Australia or Korea Water. But in order to protect the water resource, what we did was we added what we call a universal charge in every electricity bill in the Philippines. A very tiny universal charge for watershed management, maybe 1/10,000th of a US cent per kilowatt hour was being paid by every consumer to protect, and that went to a pool of about $20 million a year, which was then used to protect the watershed of those privatized now hydro plants. So that's a model that has been working. Nobody complains about that when it's so small. And I think there's potential to kind of replicate that model for geothermal plants, because geothermal plants in Indonesia and the Philippines also need watershed to sustain the steam field. Thank you.
Any other audience questions? Over the other side of the room. A bit quiet over there today. Oh, we've got one down the front, Sarah.
So it's my understanding that a lot of the Southeast Asian countries have...
No, it's not. Can we just get the...
Sorry.
There we go.
Thanks, Ryan. It's my understanding that a lot of the Southeast Asian countries have introduced feed-in tariffs for biomass power, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your thoughts, Vince, around wood products and how that might tie into that.
Thank you. Thailand started this by introducing what they call an adder, an add on the grid rate for wind, solar, and biomass. And then the Philippines followed, and Malaysia, and lately Indonesia. What they've done is they're trying to promote, well, part of the problem is that people burn agricultural waste. So you have, well, we're seeing it right now in Sumatra, and the Singaporeans are very upset about that. And what they're trying to do is see a way to have this agricultural residue be consumed and converted to fuel. So a lot of them have given feed-in tariffs at very attractive rates of as low as 7 cents in Malaysia, up to 14 cents per kilowatt hour, which is pretty attractive in the two resource poor countries. I'm talking about Thailand and the Philippines. And most were, shall we say, focused on the sugarcane business or the palm oil, but rice husk. But the thing is, they're seasonal. You know, you have a planting season, the harvest season. Sugar, there's a planting season, there's a harvest season. So the problem is that what does one do when it's off season? The biomass power plant infrastructure is there. It's financed for 20 years. Half of the year it's not being used, and that's where I think wood chips, wood pellets can come in from Australia, New Zealand. Interesting enough, the two biggest market right now for wood pellets is Korea and Japan because of feed-in tariffs. And a lot of the Korean trading firms and Japanese trading firms have come to Southeast Asia saying, why don't we build a biomass power plant based on wood pellets from Australia, New Zealand, because that's their way of sort of leveraging supply. Any shipment of wood pellets to Korea and Japan has to pass through Southeast Asia. So I think there is a latent potential for additional demand for wood pellets in that part of the world.
Another question, right out down the middle here.
Vince, I think it was Michael Jenkins who was talking about, you know, some of these aid agencies are becoming less relevant because there's sources of capital within emerging markets that are just becoming so large in and of themselves.
Yes.
Can you comment a bit about that, and how are those local sources of capital a potential to drive change around sustainability or governance or social management within their own jurisdictions?
Thank you. As you said, traditionally, most of the funding for, shall we say, sustainable investments, either driven by the Equator Principle, is the World Bank, or the Global Environment Facility, the GEF, or Asian Development Bank. And lately, in the early part of the last decade, a lot of the funding were sort of through IFC, ADB, World Bank, IFC, with sort of GEF grants. But perhaps because of the lessons learned from the previous Asian financial crisis, a lot of the commercial banks are very liquid now, and their banking balance sheets are healthier. And so you've seen folks like IFC do sort of co-guarantee facilities with local banks, whereby they'll take part of the risk. IFC would take part of the risk in exchange for providing technical consulting services on how does one lend to sustainable investments, whether it's timber or solar or wind. And so now part of the challenge has been educating domestic banks. They're liquid, but right now it was annoying that they would only charge a much lower spread for a coal power plant, 200 basis points, versus wind or solar where they'll charge 300 to 350 basis points. When you think about it, solar and wind has no resource supply issue, but then coal, which is imported, probably has more fuel risk. But it's because of their lack of familiarity with the risks of lending to sustainable investments. So over time, it's good to know that the domestic banking system, which is pretty liquid in Thailand at least, Malaysia, definitely Singapore and the Philippines, the tenor has lengthened from 5 years to 8, 12, and now you could actually see even 15-year financing, which makes equity returns far more interesting now, when you could get debt financing at that level. But a lot of it requires a lot of consultancy, and as a matter of fact, a lot of Aussie firms here have done a lot of lender technical advisory work in providing consulting services to banks.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, no, we've got one more. Sorry, Natalie. Thank you.
Hi, Vince. Natalie Cady and PricewaterhouseCoopers. You mentioned some of the challenges of private investment in Southeast Asia, overlapping land titles, limited information, old data, not having sustainability practices or best practice. One thing I'd like you to sort of comment on, and maybe this has already been touched on briefly, is the other area that I think that is a challenge for Southeast Asia is the focus by private investors on anti-bribery and corruption, particularly given the potential severe financial and reputational consequences for being associated in those types of activities all the way up the chain. How have you dealt with, or what sort of recommendations or suggestions can you give to people who are interested in investing in Southeast Asia but have these challenges and have these extra hurdles they need to comply with?
Right. I have a wind farm that's got institutional fund money from European development institutions. I think it even has a superannuation investor from Australia. And of course, anti-corruption, anti-bribery is a mandatory investment covenant that me as an investee company have to comply to. So even without that, being a former government minister, I would never go down that slippery slope of bribery, because once you give it, then it gets bigger and bigger. So I had to deal with the mayor who was trying to ask for something under the table, and I tried to avoid that conversation, but he was blocking a permit. So finally, I actually brought a copy of the shareholders agreement and showed him Section 12 provision, anti-bribery, and showed it to him and said, look, I cannot give you what you're asking for. So the mayor said, oh, you should have told me a long time ago. You should have told me a long time ago. So, of course, then it became a very interesting conversation about, I used to be a government minister, you're a local politician, how can I make you look good without having to violate these things? So we've done joint education programs where his name is on the bag full of school equipment. So one can deal with it, and you just have to meet it up front. And it's a covenant that we have to comply to, especially with institutional money. And of course, those have to be audited as well.
Great. Good question. Thanks very much, Vince. Everyone, please.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vince, for his time. Fantastic.